So the other thing I wanted to talk about today was determinants of vote choice. So essentially, how do people make up their mind? So they've decided they're going to vote, they're not going to vote, although these two processes oftentimes happen at the same time. But you decide, I'm going out to vote, you're getting over to the polls. How do you choose who you're going to vote for? And what does that look like in Canada? So there's a few things that political scientists have thought about how people make their choices when it comes to elections. So the first factor that we see is pretty significant and pretty consistently significant is party identification. So people often feel as though they are a member or a supporter or at least somebody who leans towards a particular party. So actually a lot of voters have made up their mind even before the election campaign starts. They are a supporter of a particular party. Maybe their family was, maybe their household has always been, say, NDP supporters, and so before the election campaign even begins, they know, well, in general, I'm always going to vote for this particular party. And so party identification is probably one of the strongest predictors of vote choice, one of the strongest ways that we can figure out who somebody's going to vote for. I often think of determinants of vote choice, just as an aside, as kind of like if you didn't know exactly who somebody was going to vote for, how could you predict who they'd vote for based on other characteristics of themselves? So that's another way we can understand determinants of vote choice, in case that phrase is a little confusing. Right, so party identification, super key, and pretty consistently key around the world and in Canada as well. But then we also say that there are going to be certain social factors that influence who somebody votes for. And so this is from what we call the Columbia School. So essentially people at Columbia University came up with this kind of stuff. They wrote a book about it back in the 60s or something like that. And so there's three main social factors that we're going to talk about. So the first is social class. So that's essentially, are you upper class, middle class, are you lower class? And in a lot of countries, class is really important. And actually, the left-right ideological spectrum that we talked about when we talked about ideologies is kind of built on it being kind of social class-based, based on how much input do you want the government to have in the economy. And so we often think of our ideological spectrum, left-right, in terms of rich people tend to be more conservative and want to keep the existing order versus a little more left-leaning would be poorer people who would be more interested in having a greater say and control in the means of production as you get into socialism. Canada is kind of strange, though, in the fact that we don't really have class voting as much as other countries do. And it tends to hold, regardless of how you measure class, whether it's economics or what kind of profession you have, it doesn't seem to be a huge predictor in Canada. And so we really don't even have class parties. There are people who are from a variety of different classes who support each of the major political parties in Canada. So a lot of scholars have tried to figure this out. Why is this the case? And they say pretty much it's because social class is not the major cleavage. Remember we talked about cleavages with Lipsick and Roken about how there are certain basic divisions in society. And so these scholars have said, well, maybe it's not social class that's the basic division. Maybe it's something else, like region. So even when you even when you control for the social makeup of regions, we find that voters from one region to another tend to have different voting patterns. Of all the social background characteristics, in fact, region of residence turns out to be the strongest single predictor of vote. And so some big examples of this could be, for example, out west, the Conservatives tend to have great support in Alberta, at the national level at least. For example, the Reform Party came out of a reform movement in Alberta, and so it got most of its support there. You're probably not a Bloc Québécois voter if you weren't living in Quebec. That Ontario and Quebec tend to be, the big sources of support for the Liberal Party, although that's changed over time. But the Conservatives and Liberals tend to battle it out for Ontario. Northern Ontario, the NDP tends to get a little bit more of a sway in there. So region is actually one of our largest cleavages in Canada, not surprising because we are such a big country and such diverse regions. And so region is going to be a very big predictor of vote choice. Or if you wanted to predict who somebody was going to vote for, knowing where they're from was going to help from that. The last thing is religion. So religion, we kind of think shouldn't play an important role in politics anymore. There was an era we saw with Lipscomb and Roken where the church versus state was an issue. And in Canada, we would think, well, that's not really a huge cleavage anymore. But scholars have noticed, especially this scholar Andre Blais at the University of Montreal, he's noticed that there's this liberal-Catholic relationship in Canada. Catholics tend to vote for the Liberal Party, which is really strange because it's not even like the Catholic Church has the kind of impact or influence on politics as it used to. And so people say that maybe it's a socialization effect, that Catholic parents are just better at passing on their political opinions to their children. It could be about concentrations of Catholics embedded into a specific network. It could be about conceptions of nationality that tend to be alongside this Catholic spectrum. And so it's really strange that, up until pretty recently, being Catholic was a good predictor of voting Liberal. So scholars have not really figured out why that's the case and why that's still important, because we would expect that religion wouldn't play as huge a role in vote choice as it used to. So essentially, we're kind of moving down from the long-term effects to the short-term effects. So party identification and social factors are these sorts of long-term things that before you even get to an election campaign, these things are already pretty much decided. And these are the big factors that are going to influence who you vote for before you even get to that election campaign. But now as we get closer to the election, there's other more proximate issues and effects that are going to come up. And so the first is issues. And so one of these issues that we're going to talk a lot about today, so we're not going to talk quite as much about social issues or single issues, is economic voting. So how the economy influences who people choose to vote for. And so essentially scholars have looked at this relationship between how the economy is doing and how the current and opposition party fare in an election. And they ask a few questions. Well, first of all, does it matter how we measure the economy to see this relationship? And some scholars, Nadeau and Blais, also same Blais, so coming from University of Montreal, they do some great research out there, have noticed that unemployment is one of the biggest indicators. So people tend to punish the incumbent governments, the government that's already in power, or reward them based on whether the unemployment rate is going up or down. And this doesn't surprise us because it's kind of a good measure of how, in general, people's personal economies are doing. We also have this question, like I just said, of personal economy versus national economy. So is it about personal economic circumstance or is it about national trends? And so they say a study by Gerbout and Bélanger, again, from Montreal. Actually, yeah, I think they're both from Montreal. Well, one's at McGill, but anyway, point being, it depends on where you live. So in have-not areas, you're more likely to vote based on personal circumstances, and then in have areas, so in the richer areas, you're more likely to vote based on how you think the national economy is doing. But both personal economy and national economy are going to have an impact on how you vote. And so we often say that economic voting is one of the key predictors of especially when it comes to issues regarding how people are going to choose to vote, simply because economic circumstances, so whether you are employed, whether your personal finances are going well, whether the country is prosperous, those are going to be some of the key issues. And if things are going really well, you're more likely to reward the incumbent government. And if things are going really poorly, you're going to punish them and say, well, I guess we have to get somebody else in to fix up this mess. So those are issues. And then the last thing we want to talk about is campaign effects. So these are the most proximate or the most short-term effects because every campaign is going to be different. So there's a few different things we want to think about when we're thinking about the impact of election campaigns. The first is the party leader. We often think, even though we're not voting for the party leader specifically, unless you live in the riding of Papineau, you can't vote for Justin Trudeau. We often think about the party leader when we are going to the polls. And so people who are, so essentially people are going to evaluate how they think the party leader would govern, what they think about this party leader, and then vote for the local candidate that corresponds to the party of that party leader that they tend to like. Research demonstrates it has some small effect, might not be quite as huge as we think it is. The next thing is your local candidate. So how many people are actually thinking about the local candidate when they go and vote? Not as many as we would think. Oftentimes, when you go to vote, you're thinking about either the party leader or you're thinking about the political party itself. That local person has probably about an effect, as like a decisive effect for about 5% of Canadians voters. So it's a very small effect that the local candidate can have, but you might be evaluating that local candidate's characteristics, especially if you know them or if you know of them. You might be more likely to use that name recognition to go vote for them at the polls, but it's more likely that your partisan affiliation or how the national campaign is going to influence who you end up voting for. Strategic voting is a thing, especially in our first past the post system. And so that's something else you have to take into consideration. So strategic voting essentially just means that you don't really want to vote for a party, but you think that they're going to be the most likely to defeat a party that you really don't like. So you vote for them as opposed to the party that you actually probably would prefer to vote for. So an example from my riding back home. So my riding back home is pretty conservative versus liberal. And so let's say you are an NDP supporter. You tend to generally support NDP views, but you see that the race is really tight between the Conservatives and the Liberals. And so you say, well, I would prefer to vote for the NDP, but I know that it's a race between Conservatives and Liberals, so I'm going to vote Liberal because at least they're closer to my views, and at least I know that I'm going to help get that Conservative guy out, or not let the Conservative guy in, or girl. So that's what strategic voting looks like, and especially in our first past the post system, it makes it's oftentimes the case that people have to engage in this kind of strategic voting because only one candidate can win per riding. And then the last thing, of course, is campaign effects. So what's going on in the actual election campaign. So there's going to be a national campaign and a local campaign. And sometimes things that happen during the campaign are going to cause issues. That's why a lot of polling firms do kind of day-by-day tracking, because they can notice when there's a particular gaffe or when there's a particular event or a leaders debate. They can see the difference in how people's public opinion is changing over the course of the campaign. So just quickly to look a little bit about the campaign itself, there's generally almost two campaigns going on at the same time. There's the national campaign where that's going to be leaders tours and big campaign platform announcements. There'll be national leaders debates. Usually those are televised and targeted TV, radio ads, those sorts of things, and calling and polling happening at the national level. But then there's also a whole other campaign happening at the local level, because remember, we vote at the local level. You vote for a local person. So there's going to be local candidate debates, meet the candidate events, and be a lot of door knocking. So local candidates usually during a campaign are out door knocking, going to meet as many people as possible, because we know that if you met the candidate, you're more likely to remember them and vote for them. And then on election day, there's a whole local campaign strategy, especially in competitive ridings, where they're going to be identifying supporters and getting those people out to vote, and trying to get as many people as possible who they know are supporters out to the polls by constantly reminding them all day. So one thing we sometimes forget about elections in Canada is the fact that we do have both this national campaign going on, the one that we probably pay more attention to, as well as a local campaign happening with a local apparatus. So those are the main determinants or predictors of vote choice. So if you had to figure out who somebody was going to vote for before knowing much about them, you could kind of look at these particular factors. So party identification, social factors, issues, and campaign effects. So that's it for today. So head on over to the quiz, and we'll see you in class.